our progress, that we've been making so far with Build. So maybe we'll just pull up the slides and get going. Just for everyone, we will be recording this session, and we will have opportunity after we go through the slides to open it up for discussion and comment. So again, thank you for joining. BILD, as you know, is building infrastructure locally for decentralized water systems. And today is our second meeting with all of us together. And we wanted to, if we go to the next slide, please. We can provide some updates. But first, just as a quick reminder, the scope of BILD and what we're trying to do is certainly is our goal to accelerate the adoption and implementation of decentralized water systems while protecting public health. And through all of the work that we're doing together is to develop a roadmap that drives us towards that goal. Our working groups, have been very active and have been meeting throughout the spring to identify key challenges and specific actions that we can feed into the roadmap. And just as a reminder, we're looking at all types of scale for decentralized water treatment systems, from appliance to single-family home, single-family home building and district/campus style scale. This is applicable also to different types of decentralized water systems, including residential, commercial, and industrial. Next, please. Just a quick overview. We have broad participation, which is wonderful, from product manufacturers to utilities, public health regulators, designers, code and standards organizations, academia, research organizations, international organizations, and NGOs. We have over 230 participants, and that number just increases over time, certainly as more people learn about our initiative. And we've established to date 4 working groups: public health, sustainable technology and innovation, capacity development, and communications. And today we're going to hear from each of the leads of these groups to talk about what the discussions have been occurring over the past several months. Next. And so again, we'll hear about the updates.
That's what I mean. We need to.
We're also going to hear about some of the prioritized actions that have come through those discussions, through the work groups, and then we'll circle back on next steps, and then, of course, open it up for conversation in terms of comments and discussion from all of you. So I think this is my last slide. Yes, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Jane, who's going to be providing updates from the Public Health Working Group. Michael.
Hey, thanks, Paula. Good morning, evening, afternoon to everyone. On behalf of myself and Brian, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this group over the last couple of meetings. We've been able to brainstorm a bunch of ideas under this concept of public health and how we can better approach public health protection in our on-site systems. And so we've tried to distill some of our conversations down to these key challenges. And so hopefully everyone will see their inputs on one of these bullets here. But we have tried to organize it into a manageable structure here. And so some of the challenges that we've discussed included a better definition of public health protection. And so one of the things that we would like to do is take broader perspectives on public health and what that actually means. And so including things like the value of hygiene interventions. And so if there's a situation where there is currently no water sanitation hygiene in place or very poor quality, then these could really provide positive benefits to the users and from their direct public health benefits. But also we want to have a broader perspective on the ways that these systems can really improve community well-being, and considering things like social determinants of health and how these systems can improve other aspects of the community in which they exist. One of the things that we realize that we need to do better at is considering local context. And so one of those elements is regulatory norms. And to date, our work on this risk-based framework has really been US-centric and focused on how do we incorporate that into our US regulatory structures, which is great for the US, but certainly not directly applicable everywhere. And so we talked a lot about European context and how just the way that they approach water management, the structure is different. And so making these frameworks adaptable to those structures. And also considering different implementation conditions. And so if we're putting these systems in a high income country versus a low income country, or a place where there's high levels of endemic disease versus low levels of endemic disease, or different settings, different types of reuse applications, how can we incorporate that into our risk assessments? And so along with that goes this concept of appropriate assessment metrics. To date, we really just focused on a couple of metrics that have been adopted from other fields and used for on-site water reuse. And so can we do better? And can we make metrics that are truly fit for purpose and adaptable to those different conditions that I just mentioned? Further, we talked about conducting integrated assessments and try to better capture some of these cost and benefits and environmental trade-offs into our risk assessment. So it's not just your direct exposure risk of being exposed to, say, pathogens when you use a system, but what other types of costs and benefits are associated with those that could also be translated into risk, if you think about it a different way. We talked about improved validation and monitoring, and so making sure that these approaches are adaptable to different technologies. And also, they have an appropriate balance of risk conservatism. And so currently, we have our risk assessments and we have our monitoring procedures, and both of those involve some risk calculations and trying to manage risk, but they're done in silos. And so we have conservative risk assessments, conservative monitoring schemes. Can we bring those together to develop one risk management framework that incorporates both those concepts into a unified approach that is not doubly conservative? We talked about expanding risk assessment applications. And so expanding to potable and near potable uses. We already hear conversations about this occurring, be it on-site direct potable use for drinking water or using it for other applications such as showering and hand washing that are traditionally used with potable water. Right now, our risk assessments focus on enteric pathogens, which is appropriate for the current set of end uses. But as we expand into these non-potable uses, as we think about other, near potable uses and other types of applications, where there could be, say, cooling towers, where there could be downwind transport of contaminants, looking at chemical risk, concerns like Legionella, making sure that we're conducting appropriate risk assessments, again, that are fit for purpose and address different applications that people are considering on-site reuse for. Other settings of interest we'd like to expand for right now are the core of our risk assessments focus on large buildings, multifamily scales, district scale reuse. As we move into single family or appliance scale reuse, or as we talk about industrial reuse, developing risk assessments that are, again, specific to those applications. And then finally, supporting risk-based implementation. And so establishing risk management structures. And so who is really, think about broader perspective risk, who is really responsible for these systems and what types of risk are they assuming by becoming that management or that management entity. And then making sure that our risk-based approach aligns with local requirements. I mentioned the European context. And so things here in the United States like water rights, but also things over there like water safety plans. Basically, translating these risk approaches into the right language so that they can be used in different areas. Next slide, please. And so some identified opportunities, I'll try to go fast this because it's somewhat redundant perhaps with what I just laid out on the challenges. And so the first thing that we'd like to do is develop appropriate assessment metrics. And so again, considering context appropriate risk targets. And how can we integrate these assessments with economic, environmental, and community cost benefit analyses? Expanding the risk framework to global settings. And so global European guidances is something that we've discussed a lot about. We have a couple of members of our team who are from Europe and are interested in that topic. And so hope we can do some work there, as well as adaptation to developing regions. And part of that goes along with this new risk benchmark development to make sure that these are truly appropriate and we're not being overly conservative in places where they could have a true public health benefit. Integrated risk-based management, incorporating the validation, the crediting, and the monitoring parameters all together into the same risk assessment. Again, not siloing it out, so we end up with conservative levels of protection, but really trying to be reasonably conservative and not overly so. And an overarching framework for treatment process crediting that can be applied to new and innovative technologies. And then finally, expanding the risk assessment applications, addressing potable and near potable uses, single-family appliance scale, and industrial on-site reuse. Next slide, please. So a couple of key overlaps from our conversations to point out here. The biggest one, perhaps, is with the Sustainable Technology Innovation Group. People who have been in those meetings will know that they've talked a lot about monitoring. And so our different challenges here related to monitoring, developing these crediting frameworks, integrating the risk assessment and monitoring into the same approach, those clearly have some overlap with the technology group, which we'll discuss later on today. Capacity development, some overlaps there. These integrated assessments, the idea of making value propositions it seems related to capacity development. This concept of identifying appropriate management responsibility structures seems capacity related, and then alignment with local policies and norms. Again, making sure that we can actually implement these approaches in different areas. And then finally, the communications group, the cost benefit analysis, which was mentioned a couple of times in our group, that really does relate to telling the co-benefit story and really essentially making the sale for these systems. And I believe that was my last slide. Over to you, Jay.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to cover this topic kind of the same way, using the same format that Mike did. Sybil, I think, is on. She was Sybil and I kind of oversaw the meetings, but I want to thank everybody who participated. There was a really strong group of participants. Everybody really became Miro aficionados. They really got a lot of information downloaded into the Miro boards and were able to kind of track a lot of information quickly. So next slide. We started off with the challenges. And, some of this, as Mike already mentioned, there was overlap in the discussions amongst the groups. Some of these you've already seen a little bit. Felt like there was lack of kind of standardized crediting frameworks and certification processes for these systems, particularly for small decentralized systems. A lot of talk about co-benefits in terms of assessing these decentralized water systems. That stemmed also, I think, carried over from the summit that we did last spring, where people were really emphasizing that we needed to tell a better story about the co-benefits. Again, lack of effective and efficient monitoring and response. I think whenever we talked about monitoring, I think we were really wanted to make sure that it encompassed both monitoring and control approaches. The issue of emerging chemical contaminants was raised. Overall cost and financing. Also, how do we integrate the decentralized with centralized systems and trying to bring in that continuity amongst the different sectors? We also talked about technical capacity, even though it's not necessarily innovation related. We also want to make sure that there was workforce that could deal and flexibly handle a range of different technologies. Also, general concern about regulatory uncertainty, and also trying to make sure that we were cognizant of developing the right technology for the right application and the right scale. And as Paula indicated to begin with, we're talking about a fairly large range of scales too, even within the decentralized. Next slide. We moved on to identifying opportunities. These are somewhat listed in order of priority. And we actually had some voting that we did in one of the meetings in terms of prioritizing them. So this idea of developing the protocols for crediting and validating with sufficient flexibility to enable new technology, because we wanted to make sure that we were open to development of new technology within the innovation group. So that was the one that kind of rose to the top. Also developing test beds for developing and validating both treatment technology and monitoring technology. The thought was that if we really are going to build innovation, sometimes the roadblock for that innovation is just being able to validate the systems effectively. And without that, we're kind of going to get stuck with the same systems that may work, but can we really improve them without having facilitation of testing and validation of new approaches? And how do we enable that testing through providing some test bed for this? Obviously, monitoring was important, and we put in the caveat that, especially for these smaller systems, we need to have monitoring protocols that really enable autonomous control. And then test beds were so important; they're listed twice here, but really it's the same thing, emphasizing both treatment and monitoring. The other ones, regulatory certainty, trying to develop tools for integrated assessment. That was important. A lot of discussion didn't quite reach the top. Also, flexibility and risk tolerance. Mike talked about this a little bit, having different kinds of risk levels maybe for different kinds of applications was important. clearly thought workforce development was important and needed to be in action, including being able to train the workforce for a variety of different applications, including a range of these potentially innovative approaches. And then source control was one action that was put forward as a response to the chemical contaminants. With these smaller systems, can you try to eliminate the source of them effectively and therefore address the issue? But again, these were somewhat in priorities. When we get to the slides later on, you'll probably see the top ones kind of come out as the priority topics. Next slide. In terms of overlaps with other groups, as Mike mentioned, the validation and crediting and monitoring, those are things that clearly are overlaps, and also I think part of the reason why they rose to the top of our priorities. Capacity development, like I mentioned, we need a workforce with a broad range of knowledge for a range of technological approaches. And for the communications, I think the real key overlap there potentially is really being able to develop this how do we convey the message, the story of the broader impacts of these decentralized reuse systems, i.e., co-benefits that Mike was referring to. Next slide. I think that's it for me. I don't know, Sybil, anything you wanted to add?
You did a great job, Jay. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jay. I'm going to talk about the capacity development working group that we met with over the spring to talk about workforce related things, but also um, other types of institutional barriers as well that we discussed. Some of the key challenges that came out of our discussion included a focus on utilities having institutional challenges with integrating DWS and centralized systems, stunting the acceleration of adoption of decentralized systems, lack of tools to help end users, such as developers, be aware of the appropriate technology solutions, lack of guidance for building owners on how to manage DWS as a long-term asset to improve understanding of financial and O&M responsibilities, barriers to entry for operators of decentralized water systems, for example, long time frames to get certifications, and lack of clarity on what the appropriate workforce pipelines are. And then, as well, how to enable decentralized water system marketplace while protecting public health in areas that don't have the capacity for public health enforcement. We identified a number of opportunities, and they are trying to address some of those key challenges that were presented on the slide previously. The first on here is creating a framework to help utilities understand the value to support adoption of decentralized water systems, including integration of centralized and decentralized at various implementation scales and strategies as well. The second one here is developing a systematic approach to identify the right existing pipelines for training and certifying individuals to install and operate decentralized water systems. Developing a strategy for hands-on training program for operators of decentralized water systems. Developing a business model to enable utilities to provide in-house services to operate privately owned decentralized water systems. Developing an example asset management plan for building owners, both existing building owners or planned in future if buildings get sold, to set out clear roles and responsibilities, including financial and other responsibilities of long-term asset management. One particular aspect that came up out of that was including recommendations for how to manage insurance for operators as a building owner. And lastly, develop a strategy to cross the bridge between available tools and artificial intelligence and what's allowable by regulators. Certainly, we saw a lot of overlaps with the other working groups as well, particularly with public health. This idea of looking at the risk profile of decentralized water systems compared to centralized and how the risks may change with more use of automation and artificial intelligence. Is there a case for relaxing daily water quality testing? There was a concept of establishing a unified list of permissible uses and acceptable water quality standards. Under sustainable technology and innovation overlap, develop an example O&M plan that covers a broad range of aspects and technologies. research on how AI could support reduced labor while ensuring systems are operating safely. For example, getting back to this concept again of reducing the amount of manual biological sampling. And then on the communications front, more engagement is needed with key stakeholders, including the plumbing industry. We would love to have a data repository or a central site for videos, fact sheets, and regs and the like, and more opportunities to incentivize affordable housing to implement decentralized water systems. And now I'll turn it over to the communications group.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Harper, and I want to also say we had a really incredible group. I'm excited to try to summarize all the amazing topics that we talked about. Everyone was so involved, and we just had trouble even like getting to everyone. So it was great. Next slide. So we ended up collating around a few themes and challenges in the communications work group. One was this idea of describing why decentralized water systems are important and then communicating that local context. So whether it is um, like yeah. So anyways, communicating the local context. And then there was a communication gaps for three primary stakeholder groups. There were a few others mentioned, but these were the ones that we talked about the most. Developers were a key group. We also don't really have any developers as part of BILD, so there's a lot of opportunity to start engaging them. Local government, utilities, and elected officials were another group. We may not have clearly communicated the need for distributed water systems, the why, and while some drivers are easy to understand, including drought, resilience to natural disasters, other factors such as cost are not always clearly communicated. For developers, we're not always speaking the same valuation language. A utility might want water savings and centralized infrastructure relief, while a developer sees value in reduced tap fees. And then for building occupants, these occupants often don't understand the need to care for these systems and their roles in success of the building operations. So those were some of the big challenges that we identified. And then we'll move to some opportunities. So we said that we should develop a statement regarding the importance and need for distributed water systems. You heard that across a few different topics, and especially capacity building. But I think it's important when we talk about our actions later to think about this across all of our groups, not just as a communication specific topic. We need to better highlight the importance and value of distributed water systems, and then, of course, reducing these communication gaps for these specific groups. And we could do this by better building relationships, improving trust, identifying available resources, and any communications gaps, and then creating targeted resources to ensure people know that these exist. We heard, communications can be too boring, too technical, or not tailored. So it will be important to tailor these things. We don't always speak the same language. So building that trust in those relationships will help us create some of that same language. And then better tapping into community leaders, whether it's media, public health officials, or advocacy groups that are local, will help build that local context and get broader support. Next slide. So most of our overlaps were with capacity development, how to communicate and engage with the workforce who will operate and maintain these distributed water systems. They can be a good first line of communication as they run into people to talk about this. So making sure they understand what it is will be helpful. Increasing the knowledge and experience by designers and developers. An asset management plan would help developers and builders know the long-term operations and expectations upfront. And then the capacity constraint for developers. I think if they don't know what's available, it can be really hard for them to want to take on something new. So we identified that as a major opportunity. And then sustainable technology and innovation, sustaining those long-term relationships and partnerships with vendors who play a key role. So that's, thematic across all of us. That's it.
Thanks, Ashley. So we're going to switch gears and start talking about some of the prioritized actions that have come from each group. So I'm going to turn it, I believe, back to Michael. I think the next slide belongs to Michael. Yes, thank you. Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. And so, based on all the overlaps that we were able to identify and all those points that I showed in the earlier slide, we kind of reduced this down into this key concept about expanding the risk-based framework. And so, there's really two elements we see here. One is developing a process for developing risk-based benchmarks that could adapt different onset applications and different settings. And so things like single-family homes, things like industrial use, as well as different contexts. And we mentioned the European context, which might require some new management structures to go along with it, as well as developing regions where the risk benchmark might need to adapt to the context of implementation. So that's about developing these benchmarks and sort of the overall approach. But then the second one is really applying those benchmarks to different scenarios. And so there's the long list here of different non-potable, potable, single-family appliance scale, multifamily, commercial, industrial, on-site reuse. And so our next task as a group will be to look at that list of items and try to narrow down exactly which specific applications we're going to be developing new risk assessments for. Next slide, please.
So I guess I foreshadowed this a little bit in the previous slide where I kind of talked about what we had seen flow to the top. So these are capture kind of what I said previously. The first bullet is it kind of refers to what Mike had said earlier too about developing an approach that where the crediting and monitoring is all kind of wrapped together into more of an integrated risk assessment rather than it being separate, which then runs the risk of being overly conservative on both ends and really ending up with something that maybe is unrealistically stringent in terms of requirements. So to really address that, those next three bullets are kind of the actions that we are moving forward with, and we'd already had an initial meeting on talking about kind of fleshing these out in more detail. One is improving monitoring protocols to enable autonomous control, and that would include AI. I know that was something that Taylor brought up in discussions from her group as well. That was something we talked about as well. That's likely to be important. We also wanted to develop standardized validation, crediting, and monitoring approaches to really kind of have this unified approach. And then thirdly, develop test beds for developing and validating either new treatment approaches or monitoring technology. We pulled out the monitoring protocols to enable autonomous controls somewhat separately because that was emphasized in the discussion and would be maybe a separate action. How do we advance the monitoring approaches most effectively? But we still want to really also feel like it's important to have a test bed to promote the evaluation of these new technologies, whether the treatment side or the monitoring side. And then that third one, the standardized validation, crediting, and monitoring, we feel like that would be a really important first step, right? Develop that first, and therefore then you would utilize that in whatever test bed that you would develop. Next slide.
Thanks, Jay. For capacity development working group, our group really coalesced around these two kind of themes of workforce development and asset management. Particularly developing a systematic approach to identifying the right existing pipelines for training and certifying individuals to install and operate decentralized systems. Sorry, there's a typo there. Developing a strategy for developing a hands-on training program for operators of decentralized water systems, and developing this asset management plan again for building owners to so they can understand clear roles and responsibilities, including financial and other responsibilities of long-term asset management.
So the communications work group, we collated around three different topics related to supporting communications for key stakeholder groups. So we have improved communications with the developer community to support broader acceptance and implementation of on-site reuse. Some potential activities include conducting an inventory of existing resources to identify gaps, holding listening sessions with developers to better understand their needs and perspectives, attending and speaking at conferences, frequented by developers, and then developing case studies as a resource guide. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of developers as part of BILD, so it's an opportunity to engage with them now. The next one is identifying opportunities and protocols to build trust with local government and elected officials. Some of these activities might include conducting an inventory of existing resources, providing model ordinances based on the National Blue Ribbon Commission, and making better connections with public health officials to verify water quality and safety of distributed water systems. And then provide a best practices guide to support engagement and acceptance of distributed water systems for building occupants is the third one we identified. Some activities, again, include identifying resource gaps, interactions between the operators via tours, events, etc., to increase this ownership, engagement, and acceptance of distributed water systems in your building. Bobby, anything to add?
I was just gonna jump in, and this pertains to a couple of different ones, but back from your earlier slides, one of the things that I thought was interesting in the discussions that came up was related to cost, and a couple of people made the point of, when we talk about that in these work groups or specifically with the communications, that we consider that maybe a broader view of what cost may be, like especially this action you're talking about, the developer community. And it may not just be the physical cost of the system and the components, but there are other factors in there that can really influence things. And I did want to chime in to Ashley on this was an overlap with capacity that I feel like we didn't capture in here, and I'm just realizing it now. But several people brought up in our work group like this human connection and the people-to-people learning, even amongst this work group or facilities across the country, to see them in person and really discuss experiences beyond just the written case studies and the written word. So those are just two things I wanted to pepper in there.
Thanks.
So back to me, we had the four original groups. Based on some of the discussions that the different groups had, this idea of highlighting the value of these decentralized water systems was mentioned previously based on the conversations in the individual groups. And while the comms group is, like Ashley mentioned, they're targeting actions related to communicating, and forming these better relationships with the different types of groups. There's still this underlying issue of what is it that we tell them about the co-benefits and the value of these systems. So we have proposed to actually create a separate working group to maybe further flesh out this action moving forward. I'm glad to lead that because some of the discussions, we'd had that in our group. We've worked on this issue to a certain degree, and then Shannon Spurlock from the Pacific Institute, she was also involved in some of these discussions and is willing to kind of co-lead this effort. So, and this would be, develop, not the communication plans themselves, as Ashley mentioned, but really trying to develop the metrics. How do we integrate health risk with economics, environmental impacts, and community cost benefits? Certainly, there's a lot of discussion about cost benefits, so we really need to build that into the conversation. And then these are a couple other bullets that had come out of some of the other discussions, developing a policy statement, probably more appropriate to say more guidance statement about how you talk about the relative importance, and created a framework that utilities could better understand this proposition, especially in the continuum from maybe initial decentralized system implementation within a centralized structure, but then how does that really evolve into something that maybe looks more like a nodal system of decentralized approaches linked together? So this is a separate work group. So what we're asking you is anybody who's interested in this particular topic to join this group, and it would be working separately from the other groups that have already been mentioned. And just to add, Eberhard, you had a question I saw in the chat, and I'll address it back on. You had a question about the test beds. Was that physical or virtual, in a sense? And I think Sybil had mentioned in her response that we were talking about a physical test bed where that would facilitate potential new developers, new technology developers could bring their technology to this physical test site and do that evaluation of either the treatment or the monitoring. So certainly physical was part of it, but the other action that we talked about is developing these standardized protocols for monitoring, crediting, and validating. I kind of view those as the virtual part, right? So that if we can develop these standardized approaches, anyone could use them anywhere to evaluate their technology. But when we say test beds, we really meant physical test beds, kind of taking it one step further and really seeing if we can find partners, find a route that we could really have a physical system that to facilitate that type of work. Next slide.
Excuse me. Thank you, everybody. That's great. I think now we're going to move on to building. How do we actually build this implementation plan, this roadmap that we've been talking about with all of the work that's been done to date and the prioritized actions? And so I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, who's going to talk us through how we are going to build that in terms of our next steps. Ashley, thanks.
You can go to the next slide, thanks. So if any of you are part of the National Water Reuse Action Plan, this should look pretty familiar. But we wanted to do these action implementation plans. So some of the stuff that we identified as potential opportunities, flush them out a little bit more. What are the steps and milestones you would need to achieve that overall goal of that activity? So as I'd mentioned before, for the comms group, for example, improving communication with the developer community, there'd be some steps in there that conducting the inventory of resources, holding those listening sessions, speaking at conferences. And so I would put all of that into this plan, right? And identify who is going to lead that and what is it that we're going to do. So I'll walk through the slide a little bit. We want you to come up with an action title. It should be pretty simple, action oriented. Your leader of your working group will help get this going. So I wouldn't overthink this too much. A brief description. So why did you guys think this was important? You know, you've done all these work in these working groups. We just want to come up where if I wasn't part of your working group, I understand why you thought this was something worthwhile. An anticipated timeline. We want stuff that is near term as well as maybe medium term activities, stuff that we can be accomplished. People don't necessarily lose interest, but some stuff might take a long time. Those test beds sound like they might be a little bit time consuming, Jay. So just thinking through that and helping us all understand contextually how long this should take. We have possible action leaders and key contacts. So as you're developing this pie in the sky action, who might be leading some of these activities and actions? On your calls, I would ask you to identify someone specifically to take charge, be a point of contact to do the follow-up with, hey, I think you might be someone who has a good case study. Could you write that up? So you will need to identify a potential action leader to identify who's running some of these milestones. Same thing, these partners and key contacts. We'll get to that a little bit more on the next slide. Any other background information you think is relevant? So if stuff has been done and there's resources or information that might help give people more context, feel free to add that, but you can also leave it off. So I'm more interested in the brief description. Opportunities to be gained. This just builds on a little bit more of why this is important. And then those milestones. You can go to the next slide, Taylor. So these milestones are that series of steps you think you would need. I was mentioning them earlier. Um, you should have potential leads identified for each of those milestones. You can have them unidentified for now, but of course, in order to achieve them, you need to find someone to do the action. A targeted completion date, if you think this will take 6 months or you think this takes 3 years, that's fine. It just helps us understand for a frame of reference. And you're thinking of this as a project plan. So some of these might be activities, but they don't have a paper. So it could be meet with stakeholder groups. There's no output, there's no paper, there's no website. But then an outcome of that might be uh, more refined later. So this can be an iterative process as you meet with people and further scope your action, but you should have a high level goal. We all do. This was like a great introduction to that, but then just helping us all understand what it is you're trying to achieve and how you plan to get there.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. In terms of next steps and picking up where Ashley was just talking about in terms of this template, we are proposing and plan to have more working groups discussions between now and the end of August. My last slide actually shows the dates for those meetings, so I'll share those in a moment. And then in terms of what are we going to do with all of that? We plan as the planning group is to put all of these actions together in terms of our build roadmap or implementation plan. And then we'd like to reconvene the entire group in October to review the build roadmap in its entirety, and then with the goal of finalizing the roadmap in November of this year. And so we look forward to continued participation. If we can go to the next slide. Just in terms of the dates that have been set, if you're not aware, Public Health will be meeting again on July 1st, Sustainable Technology and Innovation July 16th, Capacity Development July 9th, Outreach and Communications July 31st, and the new group, thanks to Shannon and Jay, Highlight the Value of Decentralized Water Systems, will be meeting on July 10th. And so again, the purpose of these meetings is really to take a look at the template that Ashley just shared, really get into more details so we can get more specific information in order to build the build implementation plan / roadmap. So now Taylor, I think we could just leave up the slides deck because I just want to open it up to the group. And if we want to go back to a particular slide, that might be easier if we just leave this slide deck up. And I know that there was a comment in the chat. I'll get to that in a minute, but if people could use their raise hand, that might be helpful in terms of folks that want to make a comment or have a question or want to have any continued dialogue. So while people are finding their raise hand, I'm going to go to the chat because there was a question regarding communications. The question is, in the communications conversations related to utilities, are there plans to address change in income to the water provider that could come through more on-site water systems? So, Ashley?
We haven't started fleshing out these actions yet. And so that's something that the group should consider as we flesh it out as a step or potential issue to flag. So thank you for that, Grace.
Great. So you'll capture that. And then Sissy, thank you. I see we have a volunteer already, Jay and Shannon. Sissy would like to join the new working group. So thank you very much. We appreciate the enthusiasm and interest. So let's see if there's any comments or questions from anyone in terms of what we've heard to date, where we're headed, thoughts folks want to share. This group is not a quiet group, so I'm surprised. Oh, Bobby, thank you. I see a hand, Bobby.
Yeah, I just want to ask and confirm with the different dates that you have on the screen for the
Sure.
different meetings. I think did everybody receive those invites with the purpose that if they wanted to attend a different group that they haven't been part of, to help build out an action that they could do that.
Yeah, my understanding, and Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, invites everyone to all of the meetings. So you have the opportunity to participate. Taylor, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, good deal. Yeah, and I mean, I would expect these, like as Ashley described, with the action implementation plan to translate the ideas into something tangible and actionable. Like I would expect these meetings are going to be very like focused in the some of the nitty gritty brainstorming and documenting this to physically build out those templates. So hopefully people can kind of come to those meetings with some real thoughts in mind and ready to contribute that to the plan.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. There's comment, then I'm gonna go to Anish and then Justin and then Christian in terms of order on my screen. Bob Rubin just made a comment that he liked the idea about including management approaches as part of the test beds. So he will tag this idea for further discussion at the meetings. So Anish, please.
Sure. Quick question for Jay and Sable about the test bed. So I'm glad to hear that it's going to be a physical location, and it's going to be something like NSF, or are you looking at a little bit different approach than NSF?
I think we certainly would build off examples of existing approaches for validating technology. I think, the other idea is trying to figure out ways that we could enable test beds that might reduce cost for the inventor, right? I mean, if these are new systems, maybe small companies, how do we help them out by reducing the cost as much as possible? So is there a way for other maybe government run approaches for that? We'll see. But that was certainly something that we need to consider as part of moving forward. But I would say use what existing templates there are, and then think about how we might want to try to best improve those.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think we'll have to really flesh that out through the further conversations in our work group. We stayed pretty high level still, but the NSF certification process is certainly an important one, and there are limited facilities and resources to access that, and many of the states require that. So that's certainly something we'll need to talk about. But we'll also, I think, need to talk about, what can we do to streamline that process and make it more accessible, like Jay was saying, to technology developers that don't always have the resources to go through these certification processes.
Right, and accessible and acceptable. That's another thing hopefully
Yes.
we'll keep in mind. So because you can test all you want, but who's going to accept those results and things like that? That's something to consider seriously. So
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's partly bleeds into the other question, the other action too, is developing these standardized protocols for how do you validate and credit and monitor the systems. If we can work on that and have that in place, that so any test bed really would be using that, that should increase the acceptance of the information that's generated.
very good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Anish. Justin.
So I just have a couple of questions. First thing, I think it'd be helpful to make it really more clear about how some of this will interact with the work of the broader National Blue Ribbon Commission. See on things like public health, because I know there's been a lot of work done there on different LRTs. So just having a good understanding how that workflow and how that relationship might work. And I definitely agree with the need to engage more with developers and building owners too. I know a few years back, I'll post it in the chat, but I'm sure hopefully many of you have seen this. There was an architect's guide for on-site water systems that was developed. And so that might be another community to think about, because developers need to obviously buy into this concept, but you also need to have building designers and architects take these things into consideration as well. And I think there's going to be a very, very, very strong intersection between getting developers and so forth on board with the value of distributed water systems as well. My wife is an architect, and she mentions time and time again, they'll have some really interesting things in the initial building design, but once the cost factor comes in be part of the discussion, a lot of those things tend to get stripped out. So really highlighting the value of these systems, ideally to a building owner, to a developer, I think that would be super, super critical. But just organizations like the Green Building Council, American Institute of Architects might be useful to think about at some point in sort of building that broader coalition.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Appreciate those comments. Certainly just on the first point in terms of just want to bring up, because it also ties to a question in the chat about the National Blue Ribbon Commission. As we know, there are public health regulators, state, local, and federal on that National Blue Ribbon Commission. They've all been invited to participate in BILD. There's also a cross-pollination between NBRC and BILD. We will continue to meet NBRC. As you know, that's just for public agencies, but sharing information between what we're doing in BILD as well as feeding that back to the NBRC members that aren't participating or don't have time to participate in BILD. Definitely the information is shared and will continue to be aligned with all of the work that we're doing at the Blue Ribbon Commission. Actually, just some of the Blue Ribbon Commission next steps are about looking at single family, looking at different kinds of applications, potentially potable, which fits right in with the initiatives that and prioritized actions that Michael Jane was talking about in particular, as well as some issues about finding additional crediting frameworks that Jay and Sybil were talking about. So there's the linkage, and the linkage will continue. So we are aligned. And then, yes, great idea in terms of Green Building Council and all of that. I absolutely agree. We need to make sure we keep those linkages. So thank you very much. Christian.
Thanks a lot for organizing this. I also really enjoyed the discussion in the break house. I think this is really a great initiative. So I have a few comments and one question. So first comment is about this notion of test beds. I would suggest to make this even broader. For me, it's really about having real world labs or maybe even lighthouse cities in a way at this stage, where you're not just testing one small technology, but you have a technological approach with a regulative framework, with an investment model, and it's showcased in a given context in a city that then can provide a template, not just for technology, but also how it can be embedded and made to work with the social context around it. So I think it would be really nice to work towards these real world labs or lighthouse cases that can then be sort of, actually monitored and the experiences distributed, as San Francisco did with the non-potable water system. I think this was a quite nice way to think about and go about this. So maybe just as a comment. A second one is I was just at the conference, an IWA conference on resource-oriented sanitation in Sweden. So I was focused on sort of district scale solutions, with vacuum sewers and so on, really complex resource recovery. But one of the discussions there was that for the communication, a key asset of the decentralized approaches is that they can actually be framed for very different contexts, very different problems. So you can make one framing around water scarcity. Of course, with decentralized approaches, you cannot tackle water scarcity problems in a certain way. And so then they have clear benefits in that respect. But you can also make a story around environmental protection. If you want to reduce combined sewer overflows, there's another story you can build around that. Or then, they can help with the circular economy, nutrient recovery, and so on. And then it's yet another story that you can coin around this sort of driver. And in Europe, it's increasingly also about resilience to external shocks, safety, independence, from other parts of the world, being resilient in conflict situations whatsoever. And then also there you can yet again build another narrative around decentralized sort of approaches. And I think it would be quite nice to come up with these sort of specialized narratives that work for different sort of problem constellations or key drivers. And then you have like a toolbox of narratives you can use to frame your given approach. So I don't think there's a one size fits all solution in terms of communication, but having these sort of context dependent strategies, I think this would be quite nice. And then lastly, question is about the differences, in the diffusion trajectories of different types of sort of, decentralized solutions. So here at appliance scale, these can scale through a mass market, sort of just appliances. If you're at the sort of building scale, then sort of the model of non-potable water systems, as we've seen it in San Francisco. And then if you're at a district scale, a utility can take care of the sort of operation, installation, maintenance, and so on. So there's different ways in which these different also scales of solutions can diffuse in the future. And also there, I wonder, are we pursuing a one-size-fits-all approach, or do we sort of create more sort of tailored strategies or sort of roadmaps, for each of these, let's say, type of solutions that we have on the table here.
Thank you, Christian. That's great. I'm wondering how we can make sure we take advantage and the linkages between all the work that's going on in Europe and what you were just talking about with what we're doing in Build, and again trying to make sure that um, we're coordinated. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was also a big discussion at this event. So how could we coordinate with Build? It came up quite a few times. So I think it would be really nice to think about this, how this could be structured. And then also India or like other parts of the world where these solutions are also on the table now. How could this be integrated effectively? That's the key. Maybe we have to follow up on that at some point. Or
Great. Okay. Well, I think that's definitely something we should follow up on and figure out the best way that we can do that. So I'll contact you and make sure we don't lose again all of the work that's going on in Europe, because I know there's a lot of initiatives and a lot of work that's happening, as well as other parts of the world that we don't want to not um, not have incorporated in our implementation plan. So thanks for those ideas and suggestions. And I don't know if there's anything coming out of the conference in terms of written materials would be really great, but we can talk about that later. So thank you. Okay, so Bob, Monica, and Sunny.
Hi, this is Bob Rubin. One of the things I would like us to think about as we look at outreach and communication, and I'm glad to see a couple of other academicians on the call. Every year we do a senior design project, and I'm reasonably certain that most other universities, engineering programs, architecture programs have some kind of senior design or studio project. I would encourage everybody on the call to get in touch with local universities, especially if you have any kind of professional development program, to submit to them something for a senior design or senior studio project that would involve you advising that senior design team or studio team on the value, the importance, the applicability of build projects in the future. We have a lot of older people on the call. We need to get some young people, and I think the place to start is at the university. I'd be curious to hear what Dr. Sedlak or Dr. Chauvel have to say, or Dr. Gentrania.
Thanks, Bob. Anyone want to make a comment? Back to Bob.
Yeah, totally agree about that. I think our universities are always seeking excellent design projects, and these could be a really great way to engage students in thinking about things differently. We're always talking in civil and environmental engineering and water engineering about how we have to change the paradigm by which students are thinking. And the best way for us to do that is to get them working on non-traditional projects. I think this is a goal for all of the universities, and it's great to work with your local universities to engage in these kind of projects. And the students really get excited and do an amazing job on the projects typically.
So to follow up real quick, yes, this is Anish Jantrani. I'm actually working with Dr. Rubin to offer like what you call a mini semester course next summer 2026. And it is going to be built around build systems or decentralized water systems. So what I'll be looking for is some help from this group that, hey, is there any design project that you guys want to entertain? Because part of the program is going to be requiring a sort of capstone, but it's the mini course, so it needs to be quick. But making sure the student understand what we present to them about this concept. So the final exercise will be a design project for the student that could help a community or a small whatever, building complex or something like that. So yeah, I'll probably share a little more information once my course is approved at A&M, and we'll talk a little more about it next year. Thanks, Bob.
Great. Thanks, Sybil, Nesh, and Bob. Great discussion. Thank you. Monica.
Yes, hi, great meeting. Thanks, Paula. I was thinking also in terms of this international piece, I help support our international committee, and I'm working with Bobby to pull together a global dialogue on water reuse white paper. So if there are specific asks for our committee, I have raised this build to them and shared the link. So hopefully some folks have signed up. But if we have specific countries or regions that we're looking at, and if we're just trying to gather regulations, please let me know. And I also wonder if we already have or are planning to have a file for folks to upload resources or references, regulations, stuff like that. And the last thing I'll just mention is we are planning on having some type of international global effort at our 2026 symposium. The planning for that hasn't started yet. But I think that this could somehow be integrated there, with the global dialogue on water reuse. We looked at different focus areas, and then on-site was one of the applications that we looked at as well. So if there's an interest there, please let me know.
Great. Thanks, Monica. I think that those are great suggestions and ideas, and I believe maybe through the public health group, some of that will hopefully be incorporated. So we have that. Sunny. You're on mute. I think, Sunny, you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No
Good morning,
problem.
Paula. Good morning, everyone. I just noted a couple things as the various groups were presenting, just items from consideration as the city of Santa Monica, we actually came across a few of these applications with developments wanting to do on-site reuse. So just sharing some information on what we learned through these negotiations and developer agreements. I think I heard what wastewater capital facility fees and reducing that. We did come across that. We actually couldn't reduce the capacity fee unless they have enough backup in the system, because there's often times where you might have downtime or waiting for equipment replacement. If you don't have the right redundancy, they may still need to use the full capacity. So that's something to keep in mind, both that's water and on the wastewater side. And on train operators, the city, we have our own on-site reuse systems, both at a small park scale as well as a decentralized system that serves the city as a whole, because most of our sewer goes to Hyperion wastewater treatment plant, but we scalp a portion of that. So we have both contract operators for the one that is licensed and permit at the city, but for the smaller on-site ones at the parks, those are unlicensed operators. They're primarily just to maintain the equipment, run it every so often to make sure everything's working order. So there's a difference, because on the smaller on-site, there is no certification requirements. And if you were to put certification requirements on that, you're going to have a hard time maintaining those facilities and finding personnel to maintain that, even if you contract that out, as we found. And also talking with various developers, depending on the size, there's like a break point. There's like a sweet spot where these decentralized system is economic, cost effective for them or not. So I think having some guidelines and things to think about at what point does this make sense for a developer will be helpful. The last thing I'll comment, I think there was a mention of university getting kids involved. I also teach a capstone course at USC. I actually have a syllabus that where a capstone course is designing decentralized system, both water and wastewater system, as part of our course. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to share our syllabus and what we designed to. A lot of it is really trying to achieve a living building certification to have net positive water impacts on the environment. So those are just the various considerations, I guess, I'll add to the group.
Thanks, Sunny. That's great. I would say yes, we're going to follow up on all of those items. I certainly think as a practitioner, your lessons learned are extremely important and extremely valuable to all of the work that we're doing. So we definitely would love to follow up. And if you have anything you want to share now, put it in the link, but we will also make sure that we capture that in the work that we're doing, so we don't. Okay, you're suggesting to send Sunny an email, so if you're looking for something specific, but again, the group will follow up, because we want to definitely follow up, and certainly on all of those items that you just discussed. So thank you. Any other comments or questions or thoughts to share? No. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for joining. We really appreciate all of your time over the past several months, not just today, but your past several months in terms of your ideas, your thoughts, your comments, your input, your suggestions. This is extremely valuable for all of us, and it reflects the full entire community. We hope to get more developers in that community to help us through the work that we're doing. But I think that we've really have reached a point where we've got some prioritized actions, a little more work, and that can help us lead to this implementation plan that we hope to share with you early fall, and then finalize November of this year. So again, I don't know if anyone has any last minute comments or thoughts they want to share before we conclude. Okay. Well, thank you all. Again, appreciate your enthusiasm and support, and we'll be seeing you soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.